Hey guys, welcome back to my movies. Today we're going to take a look at the dialogue of Glaucon and his interpretation of justice from Book 2 of Plato's Republic. So the discourse follows after Thrasymachus' attack on justice, where we see that for him, justice is only advantageous as a convention, particularly for the strong. We'll come to see that Glaucon actually furthers Thrasymachus' view by masking immoralism with an appeal to convention, which I think is quite a cunning move on Glaucon's part, as he uses the notion of what people think based on reason. I think that one could even argue that after reading this dialogue, Glaucon does pay tribute to human nature as well, but we'll go into that a little bit later on. But Plato presents Glaucon's rhetoric as tactical and well laid out, really leaving us to wonder if it's better to be immoral than moral. So, some central themes to consider before we move on and dissect the dialogue. We have the different types of goods, as understood by Glaucon, immoralism in its role as justice, and the origin of justice. I also want to pose a question to think about during this movie, and that being, is being just necessarily good if justice stems from human weakness and susceptibility to the strong? So the first move Glaucon makes is the distinction between the types of goods. The division of classes is devoted to developing his immoralist position. So the first division of good is good as a thing we value for its own sake. For Glaucon, this division of good is universally welcome because of its sole purpose and not because of any of the consequences that come from it. So, like joy. The catch with this division is that Glaucon doesn't actually think it exists. There aren't any results that stem from this division, and from the point of justice, this first section can be understood as the general acceptance of justice and its origins. I do find this a bit vague, but we'll come back to this concept later on. The second kind of good is the good that we value both for its own sake and for the sake of what comes from it. Glaucon uses the example of knowledge, being healthy, and having a functioning vision, so like sense perception. This is understandable in scope, like having an education has an intrinsic value despite the possibility of actually having financial success. And the third kind of good is what Glaucon calls onerous but beneficial. This kind of good only has value for what we can gain from it, but we would never choose it for its own sake, only for its reward. In our case, this would be money, physical exercise, going to the doctor for medical treatment. Glaucon proceeds to argue that justice does fall in this category. So now we're left to ask ourselves, how does this division of goods help us in understanding where justice falls? If we take into account Glaucon's third division, that good is something we value because of what we gain from it, and apply this to justice, we're able to see Glaucon's move into immoralism. He rejects justice as a kind of good we welcome, because to do injustice is naturally good, and to suffer injustice is bad. But that the badness of suffering it exceeds the goodness of actually doing it. And this can be found in 358e. For Glaucon, the masses choose to act justly to avoid suffering, or to embrace impunity, and not because justice is actually good for them. And if that's the case, then it's not actually a moral thing. Justice is just a working convention. To further strengthen his view, Glaucon uses the myth of the ring of Gyges. There was a shepherd who worked for the ruler of Lydia. There was a great thunderstorm, and an earthquake split the ground and created a hole near the shepherd's sheep. The man descended into this large chasm and saw a hollow bronze horse, and there was a corpse inside it, and who had a gold ring on its finger. The shepherd took the ring and made it his, and he later on attended a meeting at the castle, and finds that when he spins the ring, he becomes invisible to the people around him. His invisibility becomes a tactic for him, in that he actually seduces the king's wife, kills him with her help, and takes over his kingdom. Glaucon then suggests that if we were to give the rings to two other people, one who is just and one who is unjust, both would be corrupted by the power of the ring. Or quite simply, that if anyone could get away with being unjust while being seemingly moral, just as the shepherd had done, we would take the path of impunity. So this reality, as outlined by Glaucon through the myth of Gyges, can be seen in stages. So the first stage being the common view of justice and its origin. And this is something that I mentioned earlier on that we would come back to as in the first division of goods. We are left to wonder where does justice actually arise? If there is really a universal value for morality in most people, it seems more like justice might just be a coordinated, rational self-interest that's integrated into our society. This can't really be considered justice if its basis is in social contract. Then we have the second stage, where people practice justice as something necessary, but not necessarily as something that is good. If anything, injustice is naturally good. There is an appeal to human nature here. People will do what it takes to satisfy human needs. For Glaucon, it's just a zero-sum game if you can get what you want through force, rhetoric, deceit, at the expense of your fellow neighbor. And then we have the third stage where welcoming the best life being the unjust life, than the just one. Glaucon suggests that it's worse to be at the receiving end of injustice, since we all can for sure suffer injustice. But in saying this, where does justice lie if all people fall between committing and suffering justice? So it's kind of like justice is a mean. People value justice as some sort of consolation rather than wanting it to be at the butt end of justice. So what's Glaucon's point? Glaucon really tries to take away the reputation of justice by collapsing the just person into the unjust person, trying to make them one. But we're left to ask, is there really a good reason to restrain oneself if being unjust is really natural? Is morality a good enough reason to avoid being deceitful? Or is the appearance of being just really enough to interact with society? It's almost as if rhetoric or force is enough to avoid the consequences of injustice, because morality is something that has a mean to an end.